I need to get this off my chest because what happened 3 weeks ago completely destroyed my family, and I'm still processing the absolute chaos that followed. So Christmas Eve, I'm pulling a double shift at the warehouse because holiday pay is too good to pass up, when my phone buzzes with a text from my dad, Finley. The message made me read it 3 times before it actually sank in. He told me they had emptied my emergency savings account that I'd been building for 6 years, $47,000, to pay for my brother Reed's wedding to his Instagram influencer girlfriend Catalina. Just like that. No discussion, no heads up, nothing. But wait, it gets worse. The text continued with Finley demanding I cover their Bali honeymoon costs, $12,000, and he needed it transferred by Monday morning or he would tell everyone in our extended family and friend circles that I was a jealous failure who couldn't support family during important moments. The absolute audacity of this man never stops surprising me. Let me back up and explain why my family thinks they can treat me like their personal ATM. 3 years ago, I made the mistake of letting my mom Barbara add her name to my savings account when she was going through financial difficulties after her surgery. It was supposed to be temporary, just so she could access funds for medical bills if I wasn't available. I was 25, making decent money, and genuinely wanted to help during a rough time. The account grew over the years because I lived below my means, worked overtime constantly, and had plans for buying my own place. My brother Reed has always been the golden child who could do no wrong. When he was in college, they paid for everything. When he dropped out to pursue photography, they supported his dreams. When he racked up credit card debt traveling the country taking pictures of sunsets, they bailed him out twice. When he moved back home at 28 with no savings and no direction, they welcomed him with open arms. Meanwhile, I was working 2 jobs since I was 16 and paying my own way through community college. The dynamic in my family has always been crystal clear. Reed gets supported and protected. Parker gets expected to contribute and sacrifice. When Reed announced his engagement to Catalina 6 months ago, my parents immediately started planning this elaborate wedding, despite him having zero money saved. They kept making comments about how successful I was becoming, and how family helps family during special times. I should have seen this coming. After I read that Christmas Eve text, I sat in my car in the warehouse parking lot for 20 minutes, just staring at my phone. This wasn't some impulsive decision on their part. They had planned this. They knew exactly what they were doing when they drained my account, and they were betting I would just roll over and accept it because that's what I've always done. Pay for family dinners, contribute to birthday gifts, help with car repairs, never make waves. I texted back a simple response. Not happening. Finley's reply came within minutes, and it was pure venom. He said I was dead to them, that I shouldn't even think about coming to my mother's 70th birthday party next month because security would throw me out like the trash I was. He said Reed deserved better than having a selfish brother who couldn't celebrate his happiness. He said Catalina's family was already questioning whether Reed came from good people, and my attitude was proving their point. That's when something inside me shifted completely. Not broke or changed or any of that dramatic nonsense. Just shifted into a mode I'd been preparing for without realizing it. For 3 years, I'd been watching my family operate like I was their safety net, their backup plan, their guaranteed support system. They made decisions assuming I would always be there to clean up the mess or foot the bill. They counted on my predictable response of grumbling but ultimately complying. I drove home to my apartment and started executing a plan that had been forming in the back of my mind for months. I'd been documenting things, keeping records, staying aware of exactly how intertwined our finances and connections had become. When you grow up in a family that treats you like their personal bank, you start paying attention to leverage points even if you don't consciously realize it. The envelope I prepared that night contained copies of some very interesting documents that I'd been collecting over the past 2 years. Nothing illegal, nothing stolen, just information that painted a complete picture of how my family operated their finances and made their decisions. Information about their mortgage arrangements, their credit situations, their employment histories, their tax situations from when they asked me to help with paperwork. Information about Reed and Catalina's actual relationship timeline versus what they'd been telling her family about how long they'd been together. Most importantly, the envelope contained detailed financial records showing exactly how my $47,000 had been earned, saved, and then taken without any legal authorization since my name was the primary on the account. And Barbara was only supposed to have emergency access for medical expenses. Documentation that would be very interesting to certain people who had been making decisions based on incomplete information. Christmas morning, while my family was probably expecting me to call and apologize or show up with my tail between my legs, I drove to their house and left the envelope on their kitchen counter. I used my key one last time, walked in through the garage like I had 1,000 times before, placed it right where they eat breakfast every morning, and walked out. Then I changed my phone number, blocked all their social media, and disappeared from their world completely. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. Radio silence. I figured they were either too proud to reach out or too angry to care. I threw myself into work, started apartment hunting in a different part of town, and began untangling all the ways my life had been connected to theirs. Removing myself as an emergency contact, updating my address with banks, making sure they couldn't access anything else that belonged to me. Then, yesterday morning, my coworker Cesar asked if I was okay because I looked like I hadn't slept. I told him everything was fine, just dealing with some family stuff. He mentioned he'd seen some crazy drama on social media about a wedding being called off last minute and something about lawyers getting involved in family disputes. He was scrolling through Facebook when he paused and asked if I knew anyone named Reed Parker. That's when I realized the envelope had finally been opened. I created a fake social media account to check on what was happening, and what I found made me realize this was just the beginning. Reed's engagement to Catalina was officially over as of Monday morning. Her family was making noise about financial damages and false representations. Barbara had been sitting in her car in the driveway since dawn, refusing to go inside the house or explain to neighbors why she wouldn't come in. But here's the thing that really gets me. I can see from Reed's posts that he's trying to paint this as some kind of misunderstanding that can be fixed. He's posting about temporary setbacks and how love conquers all obstacles. Finley has been messaging people trying to control the narrative and minimize the situation. They still think this is something they can manage and spin in their favor. They have no idea what they're actually dealing with, and frankly, I'm just getting started. Update 1. The responses to my first post were insane. Over 3,000 comments and my inbox is completely destroyed. Shout out to everyone who said I should have acted years ago, because you're absolutely right. I should have stopped being their personal ATM the first time they pulled this manipulative garbage. So remember how I said they had no idea what they were dealing with? Well, they found out real quick what was in that envelope, and the aftermath has been absolutely wild. Tuesday morning, 3 days after I left the documents, my work phone rang. Yeah, my work phone. Finley somehow tracked down my company number and called the main line, asking to speak with me. When I got transferred to take the call, he was already in full damage control mode, trying to sound reasonable and paternal like nothing had happened. He started with this whole speech about how family disagreements shouldn't destroy relationships and how we needed to sit down and discuss the situation like adults. He said he understood I was upset about the savings account situation, but there had been some miscommunication about the terms and maybe we could work out a payment plan to make things right. He kept emphasizing that Reed's wedding had been postponed due to some unfortunate timing issues, not canceled entirely, and that Catalina's family was just being cautious about proceeding with the ceremony. I let him talk for almost 10 minutes before I responded. When I finally spoke, I told him exactly what I had documented over the past 3 years. Every time they had borrowed money from me with promises to pay it back. Every time they had guilted me into contributing to family expenses while Reed contributed nothing. Every conversation where they discussed my finances like I wasn't in the room. Every instance where they made financial decisions assuming I would cover the shortfall. But here's the part that really got to him. I had been recording our family meetings about money for the past 18 months. Not secretly, not illegally, just using my phone's voice memo app during discussions about household expenses and financial planning, conversations where Finley and Barbara discussed how much they could realistically expect me to contribute to Reed's wedding based on my savings account balance. Discussions about how they could access my money if I refused to cooperate willingly. The envelope contained transcripts of those recordings, along with copies of all the bank statements showing how my money had been moved around and documentation of Reed and Catalina's actual living situation versus what they had been telling her family about their financial stability and relationship timeline. When I finished explaining what I had documented, there was this long silence before Finley started talking again. But this time, his tone completely changed. He said I had misunderstood the family dynamic and that parents sometimes have to make difficult decisions about resources that adult children might not fully appreciate. He said Reed was going through a transitional period and needed support to get established with Catalina, while I was already stable and successful enough to weather temporary setbacks. He kept insisting that the recordings were taken out of context and that sharing private family financial discussions with outsiders was a violation of trust that could damage all our relationships permanently. He said Barbara was devastated that I would betray the family's privacy over money, especially when they had always supported my goals and celebrated my achievements. This is where I started laughing because the absolute audacity was just too much. I told him I hadn't shared anything with outsiders yet. I had simply provided documentation to the people who were directly affected by their financial decisions. Specifically, I had sent copies of everything to Catalina's parents, showing them exactly what kind of financial foundation Reed actually had for supporting their daughter. The silence that followed was probably the longest pause I've ever heard on a phone call. When he started talking again, Finley was completely different. He said I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed and that my actions were going to destroy not just Reed's relationship, but potentially his entire future with Catalina's family. He said they were already asking questions about Reed's employment history and financial management skills, and that my documentation had confirmed their worst suspicions about our family's reliability. He told me Reed had been trying to reach me for 2 days straight, calling my old number and messaging me on every platform he could think of. Reed apparently spent Monday night driving around town looking for my apartment, which was hilarious because I had already moved to a completely different area the week before Christmas. Reed was telling everyone that this was all a misunderstanding and that he could fix the situation if I would just talk to him directly. But here's what really sent Finley over the edge. I had also included documentation about their mortgage situation. See, for the past 2 years, my parents had been struggling with their house payments and had refinanced twice to keep up with expenses. What they didn't know was that I had been tracking their financial stress and had copies of all the paperwork they had asked me to help them organize when they were applying for the refinancing. The envelope included a detailed breakdown of their monthly expenses versus income, showing exactly how much they had been depending on my contributions to maintain their lifestyle. It showed that without my regular financial support, they were approximately $800 short every month on basic household expenses. When I mentioned this to Finley on the phone, he completely lost it. He started yelling about how I was trying to destroy the family out of jealousy and selfishness. He said I had always been resentful of Reed's relationship with Catalina, and that I couldn't stand seeing him happy and settled. He said my actions proved that I had never really cared about family unity and that I was willing to ruin everyone's future over money. I stayed completely calm and told him he was wrong about my motivations. I said I wasn't doing this because of jealousy or resentment. I was doing this because I was tired of being treated like their backup plan and financial safety net without any respect or consideration for my own goals. I explained that I had spent 3 years watching them make decisions based on the assumption that my money and support would always be available to clean up their mistakes. I had documented every instance where they had volunteered my resources without asking. Every time they had made commitments they couldn't afford while expecting me to cover the difference. Every conversation where they discussed my finances like they were community property. Finley tried to interrupt several times, but I kept talking. I told him that Reed's wedding crisis was just the beginning, because I had removed myself from their financial ecosystem completely. No more emergency contributions, no more holiday expense sharing, no more last-minute bailouts when their budgeting fell short. By the time I finished explaining the full scope of what I had done, Finley was quiet again. When he finally spoke, he said I would regret destroying the family relationships over money and that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt once they were burned. That's when I told him about the rest of my documentation. The envelope only contained the basic financial records and recordings. I still had detailed information about Reed's actual employment history, his previous relationships that Catalina's family didn't know about, and documentation of some very interesting financial arrangements that Reed had been making to maintain his lifestyle while unemployed. I hadn't shared any of that yet, but I was prepared to if they continued trying to pressure me or control the narrative around what had happened. The phone call ended with Finley saying this wasn't over and that they would find a way to resolve the situation without destroying everyone's future. Yesterday, Barbara finally got out of her car and started calling relatives to do damage control. She's been telling people that I had some kind of breakdown and made accusations about family financial arrangements that weren't accurate. She's saying Reed's wedding was postponed due to venue scheduling issues, not relationship problems. But here's the thing. Catalina's family has already started their own investigation into Reed's background and financial situation, and Reed is getting desperate enough to make some very poor decisions about how to handle the crisis. I'm starting to think the envelope was just the opening move, and they have no idea what's still coming. Update 2. All right, everyone, buckle up, because this week has been absolutely insane, and I'm still processing everything that went down. First off, thanks to everyone who's been following this train wreck. Your comments have been keeping me sane through this whole mess. So remember how I said Reed was getting desperate and making poor decisions? Well, turns out desperation makes people do really stupid things, and Reed just proved that in the most spectacular way possible. Wednesday afternoon, I'm coming home from work when I see Reed's beat-up Toyota Camry parked outside my new apartment complex. I have no idea how he found my address since I'd been really careful about keeping my new location private. But there he was, sitting in his car like some kind of stalker, waiting for me to show up. The moment I got out of my truck, Reed jumped out of his car and started walking toward me. I could tell immediately that he was wound up and ready for a confrontation, but I wasn't about to let him control the situation or catch me off guard. I'd been expecting this conversation for weeks, and honestly, I was looking forward to hearing what kind of excuse he was going to try. Reed started talking before he even reached me, going on about how we needed to clear the air and fix this situation before it destroyed everyone's lives permanently. He said he'd been trying to reach me for over a week, and that my refusal to communicate was making everything worse for the whole family. He kept emphasizing that this was bigger than just our personal issues, and that innocent people were getting hurt by my actions. I let him finish his opening speech, then asked him directly how he had gotten my new address. Reed got this defensive look and said he'd asked around until someone who knew someone was able to help him track me down. He said he'd been driving around different neighborhoods for days looking for my truck, and that he'd finally spotted it at a grocery store and followed me home. So basically, my brother had been stalking me for days, which really shows how stable and rational he's being about this whole situation. Reed launched into this long explanation about how the wedding situation had been blown completely out of proportion, and how Catalina's family was overreacting to some minor financial concerns that could easily be resolved with proper communication. He said the postponement was temporary and that they were working through the issues with professional counseling and financial planning assistance. He kept insisting that the recordings I had made were taken out of context and that family financial discussions were private matters that shouldn't be shared with outsiders who didn't understand our family dynamic. He said Barbara and Finley had always been supportive of both of us, and that their decisions about resource allocation were based on what they thought was best for everyone's long-term success. This is where I started laughing because Reed was trying so hard to sound reasonable and mature while completely ignoring the actual facts of what had happened. I asked him to explain exactly how draining my savings account without permission was supposed to benefit my long-term success. Reed's whole demeanor changed when I brought up the money directly. He said the savings account situation had been a miscommunication, and that they had assumed I would be supportive of helping with wedding expenses since I was in a better financial position than he was. He said they had been planning to discuss a repayment schedule with me after the honeymoon, but my reaction had escalated everything before they could explain their intentions properly. I told Reed that was complete garbage, and he knew it. I said the text message from Finley had been very clear about the money being taken and the additional demands for honeymoon funding, with threats attached if I didn't comply immediately. There had been no mention of repayment plans or family discussions, just demands and ultimatums. Reed started getting agitated and said I was being deliberately difficult and refusing to see the bigger picture of what the family was dealing with. He said they were all under tremendous stress trying to manage the situation with Catalina's family, and that my unwillingness to cooperate was making everything exponentially harder. He went on this whole rant about how I had always been jealous of his relationship with Catalina and how I couldn't stand seeing him happy and settled with someone who loved him. He said my actions proved that I was willing to sabotage his future out of spite and resentment, and that I was using the money situation as an excuse to try to destroy his engagement. That's when I decided it was time to explain to Reed exactly what I had documented about his actual situation with Catalina and her family. I told him I had been tracking his employment history for the past 2 years, including the 3 jobs he had been fired from and the 4 jobs he had quit without notice. I had documentation of his actual income versus the income he had been reporting to Catalina's family when they asked about his financial stability and career prospects. Reed's face went completely white when I mentioned the employment records. He started stammering about how job transitions were normal for people in creative fields and how he had been building his portfolio and networking while looking for the right opportunity. He said Catalina understood that he was between positions temporarily and that her family supported his entrepreneurial aspirations. I told him that was interesting because based on my documentation, Catalina's family had been told that Reed was employed full-time as a photography consultant for a marketing firm and that he was earning approximately $60,000 annually. The reality was that Reed had been doing occasional freelance photography gigs that brought in maybe $300 per month on average. But here's the part that really sent Reed into panic mode. I also had copies of Reed's credit report and bank statements from when he had asked me to help him apply for a car loan 6 months ago. His credit score was in the low 500s. He had over $15,000 in credit card debt, and his checking account had been overdrawn 11 times in the past year. Reed started talking really fast, trying to explain how his financial situation was improving and how the wedding expenses were an investment in his future stability with Catalina's family business connections. He said her father had offered him opportunities to get involved in their import business, and that the marriage would set him up for long-term financial success. I asked Reed if Catalina's family knew about his credit situation and debt load when they were evaluating his ability to support their daughter financially. Reed got defensive and said his past financial mistakes weren't relevant to his future earning potential, and that credit scores were just numbers that didn't reflect someone's actual capabilities or character. That's when I told him about the other documentation I had been saving. For the past 18 months, I had been keeping track of Reed's actual living situation and relationship timeline with Catalina. I had records of when he had moved back home with our parents, how long he had been unemployed before meeting Catalina, and the timeline of when their relationship had actually started versus what they had been telling her family. Reed and Catalina had been telling her parents that they had been together for 2 years and that Reed had been financially stable throughout their relationship. The reality was that they had met 8 months ago at a bar when Reed was completely broke and living in our parents' basement, and that their entire relationship had been built on Reed pretending to have financial stability and career prospects that didn't exist. I had screenshots of Reed's social media posts showing him at home with our parents up until 10 months ago, bank records showing when his last steady employment had ended, and documentation of exactly when he had started receiving financial support from our family to maintain his lifestyle while dating Catalina. When I finished explaining what I had documented, Reed was completely silent for almost a full minute. When he finally started talking again, his whole approach had changed completely. He wasn't trying to sound reasonable anymore. He was getting angry and accusatory. Reed said I had crossed every possible line by investigating his personal life and collecting information about his relationships and finances. He said my behavior was obsessive and vindictive, and that normal brothers didn't spy on each other and document private information for future use against the family. He said I was sick for spending years planning to destroy his happiness, and that my actions proved I had serious psychological problems that needed professional help. He said the whole family was starting to realize that I had always been unstable and manipulative, and that they should have recognized the warning signs earlier. I stayed completely calm and told Reed he was wrong about my motivations and methods. I explained that I hadn't been spying or investigating it. I had been paying attention to the family's financial dynamics because I was tired of being taken advantage of and wanted to understand exactly how much my family was depending on my contributions. I said his current crisis was the direct result of his own choices to build a relationship based on lies about his financial situation and career prospects. I said I hadn't created his problems. I had simply documented the reality of his situation and shared that information with people who had the right to know the truth. Reed spent another 20 minutes trying to convince me to retract the information I had shared and help him rebuild his credibility with Catalina's family. He offered to sign a formal repayment agreement for the money that had been taken from my savings account, with interest and a structured timeline for full restitution. He said if I would support his explanation of the situation to Catalina's parents, he would make sure our parents paid back every penny they had taken and that the family would never make assumptions about my financial contributions again. He said they could establish clear boundaries and written agreements for any future family financial arrangements. I told Reed his offer was too little, too late. I said the damage to his relationship was the consequence of his own deception, and that I wasn't interested in helping him continue lying to Catalina's family about his actual situation. Reed left my apartment complex that night saying this wasn't over, and that he would find a way to fix the situation with or without my cooperation. He said I would regret destroying the family relationships over money and pride. 2 days later, I found out exactly what Reed's new plan was, and it's even more desperate and pathetic than anything he's tried so far. Turns out Reed has been contacting my friends and co-workers, trying to convince them that I'm having some kind of mental breakdown and that the family needs help staging an intervention to get me back on track. He's been telling people that I've become paranoid and obsessive about family finances, and that I'm making accusations that aren't based in reality. Meanwhile, the mortgage situation at my parents' house has reached crisis level. Without my monthly contributions, they missed their February payment entirely, and the bank has started foreclosure proceedings. Barbara has been calling extended family members asking for emergency loans, but apparently my documentation has been making the rounds, and people are asking uncomfortable questions about the family's actual financial management. Catalina's family hired a private investigator to verify Reed's background information, and let's just say they're not happy with what they found. The engagement is officially over. Catalina has blocked Reed on all social media platforms, and her father is considering legal action for fraud and misrepresentation. But here's the thing that really gets me. Through all of this escalating disaster, my family is still trying to blame me for their problems instead of taking responsibility for the choices that got them into this mess. They're about to find out that I've been saving the most devastating information for last. And Reed's little character assassination campaign just guaranteed that I'm going to use every piece of leverage I have left. Final update. This is it, everyone. The absolute final chapter of this insane family destruction. And I have to say, watching everything collapse exactly the way I planned it has been the most satisfying experience of my adult life. So Reed's brilliant strategy of telling my friends and coworkers that I was having a mental breakdown backfired in the most spectacular way possible. My coworker Cesar, who I mentioned before, came to me directly and told me what Reed had been saying. Apparently, Reed had tracked down several people from my work and started this whole campaign about how I was obsessed with family financial situations and making paranoid accusations that weren't based in reality. But here's where Reed's plan went completely sideways. When Cesar asked me about it, I showed him copies of the bank statements proving the $47,000 had actually been taken from my account. I showed him the screenshots of the original text messages from Finley, demanding the honeymoon money with threats attached. I showed him the mortgage documents proving my parents had been depending on my monthly contributions to avoid foreclosure. Caesar looked through everything and said Reed was either completely delusional or deliberately lying about the situation. He offered to set the record straight with anyone Reed had contacted, and that's when I realized this was the perfect opportunity to reveal the final piece of information I'd been saving. For the past 3 years, I had been the one co-signing loans and credit applications for my family members. When Barbara needed the emergency credit line for her medical expenses, I co-signed. When Finley needed to refinance the house, I co-signed as backup income verification. When Reed needed the car loan 6 months ago, I co-signed because his credit was garbage. What my family didn't realize was that co-signing made me legally entitled to access all the account information and transaction histories for every financial product I had guaranteed. I had been receiving monthly statements and notifications for every loan payment, every credit card charge, every mortgage transaction for 3 solid years. I had documentation showing exactly how my parents had been spending money while claiming financial hardship. I had records of Reed's credit card spending while he was unemployed and pretending to have a steady income. I had proof that Barbara had been using the medical credit line for shopping trips and luxury purchases instead of medical expenses. But most importantly, I had detailed records showing that my family had been systematically lying to creditors about their income and expenses for years, using my financial information as backup verification while never intending to include me in their actual spending decisions. When Reed started his character assassination campaign, I decided it was time to share this information with the people who had been lied to. I contacted every creditor, every bank, every financial institution that held loans or credit agreements with my family members. I provided them with detailed documentation showing the discrepancies between what my family had reported as their financial situation and what their actual spending patterns revealed. I formally requested removal of my name from all co-signed agreements, based on misrepresentation of the intended use of credit and failure to include me in financial decisions that affected my legal liability. I provided evidence that my co-signature had been obtained under false pretenses and that I had been excluded from knowledge of how the credit was being utilized. The response was immediate and devastating. Within 48 hours, Barbara received notice that her medical credit line was being called in immediately due to misrepresentation of intended use and failure to maintain agreed-upon account management standards. The full balance of $11,000 became due instantly, with no payment plan options available. Finley received notification that the mortgage refinancing was being reviewed for potential fraud due to discrepancies in reported income and household financial management. The bank froze all automatic payment processing and demanded immediate documentation of actual household income versus reported income for the past 24 months. Reed's car loan was immediately called due for full payment based on misrepresentation of employment status and failure to maintain insurance coverage that met the loan requirements. His car was repossessed within a week, but I wasn't finished yet. I also contacted the private investigator that Catalina's family had hired to verify Reed's background. I provided him with complete documentation of Reed's actual employment history, his real credit situation, and most importantly, detailed records of every lie Reed had told about his financial stability and career prospects. The PI was shocked by the scope of Reed's deception and asked if he could share the information with Catalina's family as part of his official report. I told him absolutely, and that I would be happy to provide sworn statements verifying the accuracy of all documentation if they decided to pursue legal action. 3 days after I shared the information with the PI, Catalina's father contacted me directly. He thanked me for providing accurate information about Reed's situation and said they were considering multiple legal options for addressing the fraud and misrepresentation that had affected their family's decision-making. He also mentioned that they had discovered Reed had been using fake references and forged employment verification documents when he was trying to establish credibility with their family. They were exploring criminal charges for fraud and identity theft based on Reed's use of false information to gain access to their family and their business connections. This is when my family finally realized the full scope of what I had done and decided to make one last desperate attempt at damage control. Barbara showed up at my workplace last Monday, crying and begging me to meet with her so she could explain their side of the situation. She kept saying the family was falling apart and that I was the only one who could help them avoid complete financial ruin. She said they had made mistakes, but that destroying the family over money wasn't going to solve anything. I agreed to meet with her that evening, mostly because I wanted to see exactly how they were going to try to spin this situation now that everything was out in the open. Barbara spent 2 hours trying to convince me that the family's financial arrangements had been misunderstood and that they had never intended to take advantage of my contributions or co-signature agreements. She said they had been trying to manage complex financial situations while protecting me from stress and worry about household expenses. She kept insisting that the money taken from my savings account had been intended as a temporary loan that would be repaid after Reed's wedding, and that the additional honeymoon demands had been a miscommunication about timing and payment methods. She said Finley had been under tremendous pressure and hadn't expressed their intentions clearly in his text messages. I asked Barbara to explain exactly how taking my money without permission and demanding additional payments with threats could be interpreted as anything other than theft and extortion. She started crying and said I was being deliberately cruel and refusing to understand the impossible situation they had been facing. Barbara then tried a different approach and started talking about how much the family had sacrificed to support my goals and ambitions over the years. She said they had always celebrated my achievements and had never made me feel like I owed them anything for their support during my education and early career development. She said my current actions proved that I had never really appreciated their sacrifices and that I was willing to destroy decades of family relationships over temporary financial disagreements that could be resolved with proper communication and compromise. I listened to her entire speech, then told her she was absolutely wrong about the family dynamic and the nature of our financial relationships. I explained that I had been documenting their behavior for 3 years specifically because I had recognized that they were treating me like a financial resource rather than a family member. I told Barbara that her conversation with me was being recorded, just like all the previous family financial discussions, and that I would be sharing the recording with the creditors and investigators who were currently reviewing the family's financial situation. Barbara's whole demeanor changed when I mentioned the recording. She said I was sick for recording private conversations and that my behavior proved I had been planning to hurt the family for years. She said normal people didn't document family interactions for future use against their own relatives. I told Barbara she was right that I had been planning this confrontation for years. I said I had spent 3 years watching them make financial decisions based on the assumption that my money and credit would always be available to cover their mistakes and poor planning. I had documented everything because I knew eventually they would push too far, and I would need evidence to protect myself legally and financially. I explained that the $47,000 theft hadn't been the beginning of my anger. It had been the trigger for executing plans I had been developing since the first time they used my co-signature without including me in their spending decisions. Barbara left that meeting saying I had become someone she didn't recognize and that the family would never forgive me for what I had done to Reed's future and their financial security. 2 days later, Finley called my work phone one final time. He told me the house was going into foreclosure and that they had 30 days to vacate. He said Barbara was having health problems from the stress, and that Reed was facing criminal charges that could result in jail time and permanent damage to his employment prospects. He said if I would retract the statements I had given to investigators and agree to resume the co-signature agreements with modified terms, they could still save the house and help Reed avoid prosecution. He said the family was willing to sign legal documents establishing clear boundaries and repayment schedules for all previous financial arrangements. I told Finley his offer was completely unacceptable and that I would not be retracting any statements or resuming any financial relationships with the family. I said the criminal charges against Reed were the direct result of his own choices to commit fraud and misrepresentation, and that I had simply provided accurate information to people who had been lied to. Finley spent 20 more minutes trying different approaches to convince me to help them avoid complete financial collapse. He offered to pay interest on the stolen money, to sign over partial ownership of the house, to guarantee that Reed would never contact me again if I would just help them avoid the foreclosure. When I refused every offer, Finley finally said what I had been waiting 3 years to hear him say. He admitted that the family had been depending on my financial contributions for much longer than they had ever acknowledged, and that they had made assumptions about my willingness to support their decisions that had turned out to be completely wrong. He said they had treated me like part of their financial planning without including me in their decision-making processes, and that they understood now that this approach had been unfair and ultimately self-destructive. But then he said something that proved he still didn't understand the real scope of what had happened. He said if I would help them through this crisis, they could rebuild the family relationships on a more honest foundation, with proper communication and respect for everyone's boundaries. I told Finley it was too late for rebuilding anything. I said I had spent 3 years being treated like their personal bank account and backup plan, and that I was done being part of their financial ecosystem in any capacity. I said the consequences they were facing were the direct result of their own choices, and that I was not responsible for fixing the problems they had created. The final conversation ended with Finley saying I would regret destroying the family and that someday I would understand how much I had lost by choosing money over relationships. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, my parents lost the house and are currently living in a rental apartment that costs twice what they can afford on their actual income. Barbara has been working part-time at a grocery store to help cover basic expenses. Reed is facing multiple criminal charges and has been blacklisted from several employment sectors due to the fraud investigation. The extended family has completely turned against them once the full scope of their financial deception became public knowledge. Nobody is willing to provide loans or support because everyone now understands how systematically they had been lying about their situation while taking advantage of anyone willing to help. Reed's reputation in their social circles has been completely destroyed, and he's had to move to a different city to find any employment at all. Catalina's family is proceeding with legal action, and their case is strong enough that Reed will probably be dealing with financial judgments and legal consequences for years. Here's the best part. I've been getting updates on all of this through mutual acquaintances and extended family members who are absolutely shocked by what my documentation revealed about how the family had been operating their finances. People keep asking me if I feel bad about what happened to them, and honestly, I don't feel bad at all. I feel vindicated and satisfied that the people who treated me like their personal ATM for 3 years are finally facing the consequences of their own choices and actions. They spent years making decisions based on the assumption that I would always be available to clean up their messes and cover their shortfalls. They treated my financial success like it was community property that they could access whenever their own planning fell short. The $47,000 theft was just the final straw that triggered me to use all the leverage I had been collecting against them. They had been stealing from me emotionally and financially for years. The savings account was just the most obvious and legally actionable example. So yeah, that's the end of the story. My family is financially destroyed, socially ruined, and facing legal consequences that will affect them for years to come. I have completely removed myself from their lives, and I have zero intention of ever helping them recover from the situation they created. Sometimes the best revenge is simply giving people exactly what they deserve based on their own actions. I just made sure they got it.